Okay, everybody, thank you for coming back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Pressure John Andrews, but as always, you can just call me PJ. Well, today with me, I have Theon Ultima. Theon, thanks a lot for coming on. And do you want to tell the audience a little about yourself, your writing, everything you kind of do here on Substack?
Sure. Yeah, and thanks for having me. My Substack's pretty new, I would say, in terms of the things I've been writing. What I've been sort of specializing in writing about, and I would say it's sort of an ongoing journey at this point in my Substack writing career, and trying to figure out where I want to go going forward. But so far, I'm sort of specializing in especially film, but also sort of literature analysis, and a bit of dabbling in film review. So those are sort of the main vectors that I write about, and I try and write about sort of the deeper currents that are in threads that are in these film and various pieces of art, to try and also sort of position them today and investigate some of the parallels to maybe some bigger issues that we are facing in 2025 and what have you.
Yeah, it's something that I've enjoyed about. I read a good chunk of the film reviews that you had out today, and also we have some mutual friends in Rajiv Ram and Ancient Problems who are both Xanadu Review alumni. But I guess first and foremost, I'm curious. So, what first inspired your love of film, your love of literature? Like, do you have some favorite movies or literature that kind of got the ball rolling there? Since what I've read so far, I enjoy that you do have a deepful and more thoughtful analysis than just it's sometimes called like the high school book report type of reviews, or just like very how do I put it, like I've heard it called like good dog bad dog reviews. Like, people review media and like the degree to which it correlates with whatever their their cultural, political worldviews are. But you seem to have like a more broad view of these things than those very kind of uninteresting ways of reviewing.
Yeah, I would say when it comes to how I would like to write about film, I would almost I would almost say I don't have the most confidence necessarily, and that kind of informs how I write. And what I mean by that is there's already probably thousands of people writing film reviews on a daily basis, and I'd venture to guess it'd be difficult for me to sort of rise to the top of that heap. So I want to do something a little bit different, and that's what sort of inspired me to try and do a bit of a deeper analysis of those films. And it is apt that you mentioned. We obviously do. I think we're maybe exiting this era of sort of the box ticking for various films. And like you said, does this cohere to my political agenda or not? And is it good based on that or not? I hope we're kind of exiting that era. But you see this in even, I think, if you look at like the top 100 films on Metacritic over the past or all time, overwhelmingly, most of them have been released in the past, I don't know, 10 years, because they adhere to a particular agenda that was sort of in the cultural zeitgeist and hegemonic. And I think for the better, that's sort of changing. But to kind of go back on your original question of what inspired me to get into literature and film, it's a long story, but I think it's a good one. Growing up, I kind of came from a household that was a little bit dysfunctional, and I was actually never really held to the fire, so to speak, when it came to academic performance. Right, the situation came where my parents weren't particularly interested in my homework or tests or how I was doing, and so I kind of just coasted through school. Though I sort of felt maybe internally that I was somewhat of an intelligent kid, but I didn't necessarily manifest that in my performance. My performance was, I would say, slightly above average. And I was going through high school. It was sort of my senior year, and I kind of had this wake-up call moment of, oh, wow, I'm 18. I got to kind of get somewhere in my life, and I feel like I've been spending too much time sort of being irresponsible as a child and playing video games and not really caring about the things that maybe necessarily matter. And I kind of went through this journey of trying to, I called it my awakening back then, not to be a little bit too namby-pamby, but a journey of trying to kind of find myself and sort of assert uh, a certain will to power in terms of my intelligence and a better performance going forward through university. And so I start the very first thing I did is I picked up a copy of Don Quixote, and I challenged myself to read that, and I really loved that novel. And that sort of sparked my, I would say, wider interest in the arts beyond video games as a young kid. And from there, I have to be a little bit coy about this, but basically there's a sort of thing that I was trying to achieve in which having a breadth of film and literature knowledge is very beneficial. And so that sort of spurred branching out and really trying to engage in different kinds of literature and film that maybe were a bit beyond the scope of what I was initially interested in. And doing that, having that sort of impetus was fantastic because I watched so many films and read so many books that I otherwise wouldn't have. And yeah, basically going through all these different film and coming from different places, different time places as well, it just sort of made sense to sort of try and collate some of those thoughts and find the through lines through these different sort of mediums and pieces of art.
Interesting. Out of curiosity, why was it a Don Quixote? Why was that the turning point?
I think I was browsing 4chan at the time, and I would go on the literature board, and Don Quixote would always be sort of held in very high esteem, in people's sort of top tens and what have you. And then from there, I would go and do research on the novel, and obviously, it is sort of the first modern novel. So it sort of hit me it was also a challenging book. It's like 1,200. It's like I think 1,400 pages in the Grossman standard translation or something like that. So it was a just good challenge, a good litmus test for me of, you think you can handle these kind of stuff? Well, let's see. Let's just jump in and hit the ground running.
Well, also kind of, at least to me, I know understandably you're being coy for anonymity reasons, but it seems thematically appropriate as far as the tipping at windmills, so to speak, that it can kind of feel like at times to try to find meaning and make your own path, and like this really strange moment we're in culture and career and whatnot.
Yeah, when I read it at the time, I definitely don't think that was in my mind, but today, yes, Don Quixote is strangely a 16th century, a 15th century, or a 16th, 17th century novel is incredibly relevant today. Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
So, kind of looping back to something you mentioned earlier when we were talking about, if this this moment where we're in right now that we may or may not be exiting, that remains to be seen. Where some people call it like current thingism, woke, whatever you want to call it. It just felt like a very strange moment that I think that the last 10 years or so of movies are gonna, I feel like, probably age really poorly, just because it became between those two poles, either that side or like very reactionary against it, or like, at least to me, I can't think of too many movies or TV shows that I've seen in the last decade that I thought really exit that orbit. And to the point where, like, to me, like I could count on one hand the movies that I thought were really good, at least in the last 5 years or so. I think I've seen 3 movies in the theater, and that was Dune 1 and 2 and Napoleon, just because a lot of it just seems very tedious, like culture wars one way or the other, or endless reboots, remakes that don't really bring anything new to the table. So I'm curious to what your experience is like with that, and or like where you think that came from, because it's very easy to just say Hollywood, they just decide I hear that a lot on the right, that it's just totally infiltrated with communist activists. Like, okay, come on, really? They want to make money, and I think get woke, go broke is something that is a little overstated, because a lot of these properties do make a lot of money. It feels like not random, but it's kind of a flip of a coin whether or not these more progressive themes and movies and TV shows will be extremely successful, or like a historic loss of money, essentially.
Yeah, that's a big question, but it's an important one. I definitely agree. When it comes to film, I almost have sort of a standard that I go by where if the film was made before 2015, I would say it's generally fine. Like
It's
you
funny.
don't
I do
have to.
the exact same
Yeah,
thing. It's like I
yeah.
just anything made after 2015. It's like, I don't know about that. But go on.
Yeah, yeah. So I would say before like 2015 and before, you're generally fine when it comes to something just being, yeah, obviously there's always been, political films or films that had a very strong agenda, but they were sort of few and far between. And 2015 and before, you're generally safe. I would say between 2015 and 18, 19, you definitely want to do your research. You want to be a little careful about a film. And then post 2020, up until maybe very recently, I would say, yeah, generally speaking, they're going to kind of just be a box ticking film, but not ubiquitously. I think there are still a lot of gems that have been released in the past 10 years, both in film and TV. So you just have to be kind of careful what you're looking for. Now, when it comes to certain sort of ideals or ideology, I might be a little less on the right, I think, than some people in our sphere. So that also might kind of play into the fact that I still can find a lot of films that I enjoy over that era. Um, I guess to your point of where did it come from, part of me is almost has a bit of a hot take there that just spurred into my head the moment we were talking about it. Is that you probably were you interested in video games growing up? Is video gaming something that you have any experience
Uh,
with?
Not really. I'm really tangential to it. I only got into it like honestly in the last 2 or 3 years, but like a little bit when I was a kid, and then in the last 2 years. So if like if it's like
Hmm.
Gamergate era, like my take at the time was, it's a Godzilla versus Mothra, like annoying feminists versus annoying gamers. So I didn't have a take at the
Hmm.
time.
Okay. Yeah, my point actually goes back quite a bit. So there was the sort of infamous gaming crash, I believe, of the 70s that happened because so much kind of crap was being released on the Atari 2600 or whatever version at that time that people just kind of lost faith in anything that was released, that it was actually going to be good, especially because video games were expensive. And so there was sort of a crash, and then the Nintendo Entertainment System came along and sort of made quality their standard and kind of rebuilt the gaming industry from the ashes. So part of what I think is happening right now is somewhat related to that, in that I think the films got really expensive to make, and they wanted to be very safe. So you wanted to be a box ticker. You wanted to make sure you weren't pissing off the sort of um, zeitgeist movement that was happening through the 2010s up until maybe very recently. I think that maybe played into it. It's just these film companies wanted to be very safe. On the other end, I mean, part of it is that, yes, a lot of the film industry just had this ideological bend. Uh, Disney's a perfect example of that. I'm someone who definitely the go woke, go broke thing, it just hasn't really manifested itself, generally speaking.
Mhm.
And, Disney seems to be willing to go as woke as they can, oftentimes, and to the detriment of their bottom line. And you know, I can only think that the way you justify that is if you do have a pretty strong ideological bend in that way. You're a true believer to a certain extent. So, yeah, I would say it's a multiplicity of things. Obviously, there was just this sort of movement that was happening in the 2010s of woke, that I think was probably precipitated by, Rajiv and I talked about recently, in a podcast that I did on in Kino Veritas about Captain America: The Winter Soldier, and that film was released in 2014, and it was a very apt time in that 2014 is where I would say the sort of American system, the Bretton Woods post World War II Bretton Woods system, kind of came to an end, or at least the sort of mythology of it was starting to crumble, and people really stopped believing in it, and that caused sort of a cultural crisis. And we had different movements, whether that be the alt right or woke or Bernie Sanders, democracy, that kind of stuff. And woke sort of just won as the cause célèbre and manifested itself in the film industry with uh, movies. These film companies just wanting to play it safe. Um, so yeah, a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think that is more or less kind of the story.
No, I think that's At least I'd hope, because this is what we do here. Why people come back. But it's interesting that you say that, though, because I do wonder. I've generally heard, like, in general, like Hollywood, the entertainment industry is a couple years behind the curve at any given time, and they're just chasing trends. Because I also listened to that podcast you did with Rajiv, which is very good, by the way. Where I was kind of more, on the left and the Bernie Sanders side too. In a lot of ways, still am. I have, sympathies to right and left in different ways. But that's neither here nor there. But all that to say, like, I know a lot of people who are a lot more lefties who also really don't like the woke chick, because they think it's like pandering and kind of dishonest. And it's one of those things too where, like, I don't know if like the D&D world is anything that you pay attention to at all, but there is this like a D&D podcast done by the McElroy brothers, who do My Brother and Me, which is a popular podcast. And at first they were really praised for being a lot more socially progressive and having a lot of inclusivity. But it was this weird thing that I followed where, like, it was this inverse thing where, like, the more that they tried to play into it and do more representation, the more people got mad at them. Because I think, like, I've always said that, like, I think there's a small portion of the audience that is really, really into that thing, but most people don't care all that much, and they just want something that's entertaining and that speaks to them. And when you pander to like that, I think you run the danger of alienating people and also, like, pissing off the people that you're trying to pander to. So I don't know. It does ever seem like that to you, as far as, like, on the right wing side as well? Because I have seen that a little bit, where, like, when you try to pander and go message first, it feels like, you will have maybe a very low IQ audience who just, like, they see the boxes that have been checked and that's their only thing that they care about. But I feel like most normal people, like, it doesn't matter quite as much to them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, any of these sort of messianic or cause celeb sort of forces, whenever you see them, it is usually a small minority that's just very loud and kind of pushing the narrative forward. So yeah, when it comes to the quality of these sort of stories, whether they be like right or left, or if they're just pandering to anything in general, yeah, I think most people kind of find it patronizing. And it's the reason that a lot of the films that I've really enjoyed recently have actually been more so produced in Asia, whether that be Korean films or Japanese films. And the reason I think the reason I think a lot of people are sort of gravitating towards K-drama nowadays as well is because they're telling a ubiquitous human story, right? So there's these Japanese films recently that have been released, two that come to mind. One's called Drive My Car, which I wrote a little bit about, and there's another called Perfect Days. And they're Japanese films with pretty much all Japanese cast, and not so much in Drive My Car's case, but Japanese cast, Japanese language, set in Japan, right? But it tells a ubiquitous human story that anyone can sort of understand and empathize with, and it's powerful. And so those are some of my favorite films that have been released again in the past couple of years. And the reason, yeah, people just don't want to sort of be patronizingly pandered to. You feel annoyed. You feel like you're treating me like I'm an idiot. That I can't understand something deeper, or I can't deal with a little bit of cognitive dissonance or some conflict, some internal strife. So I think, yeah, anyone who's interested in actually making art understands that. And again, I think that's part of the reason why Asian created media is starting to eat the lunch of sort of the American Hollywood industry.
Yeah, I wonder to what degree it feels like the budget has to play some kind of role, right? Because it makes me think of as well, and you're much more of a film buff than I am, obviously, but much in the same way that, like, there is the old Hollywood that existed and got so big and bloated, and by the 60s that the new Hollywood came along, your George Lucas's, your Steven Spielberg's, and they were able to do things that were relatively lean at the time and do things that were more interesting, a little bit more new. And I'm wondering if, I guess that's, the first part of it. I'm curious to think if you think Hollywood is on the way out, because I read something a couple years ago where Steven Spielberg says he doesn't think that Hollywood is going to survive the 2020s, essentially for that reason that it's become too big, too bloated, too expensive, and everything has to make like, 200-300 million to even be profitable. Because I know a lot of
Mm,
people, there's a lot of I don't personally give a shit because I don't, I'm a man in my 30s without kids. So when people, get really mad about the Disney remakes who are in my demographic, I kind of look at them a little askance at times. But like the Little Mermaid remake technically made a lot of money, but because its budget was so big, and I've heard generally like look at production and double that for marketing, that they are still in the hole for it. So I don't know. Do you think Hollywood is going to survive this decade?
yeah, I think they will. But I think you might see some sort of, again, going back to the video game crash, was sort of, I think you might see something like that. Um, Not so much in terms of quality, but yes, because the budgets have just gotten so large that it's sort of unsustainable. Chasing profit is almost impossible if you need to make $1 billion to be in the green.
Mhm.
Um, you actually, I used to be into the video game industry as a teenager. Pretty much since turning 20, I haven't been too involved. But as I understand it, the same sort of things happening there, where the video games cost so much to make, that companies are playing it very safe. So you have sort of a dual vicious cycle of the quality is not all that great, or it's just not that interesting or new, and the production values are so high that making something that's sort of the next big thing or profitable is becoming next to impossible. So I don't think Hollywood would necessarily collapse and disappear or something like that. As I understand it, the 70s, as someone who's into film, the 70s is probably the greatest film decade. Preceding it was the 60s, which is, I think, one of the weaker ones. And the 70s is incredible. And part of what I understand of why that is that film budgets had gotten so large in the 60s that it kind of collapsed in on itself, and it sort of opened up a environment where a lot of young directors could get a little bit of cash from production studios to kind of make their weird little film and experiment. So you had a lot more experimentation, a lot of new ideas, lower budgets, like you said, with George Lucas, and that spurred sort of a renaissance in film in the United States in the 70s. So my hopeful picture would be something like that, but who knows? Who knows where things will go? There might be a resurgence of sort of the woke box checking once maybe Trump's out of the picture. It's impossible to really say.
So that kind of leads me to the one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, and I'll jump around a little bit, because you wrote about the most recent Mission Impossible, and I've heard a couple other people write about movies like the Twister remake, Twister 2 or Twisters or whatever it was, where I think what was the Top Gun sequel, where
Mhm.
but particularly you talked about the Mission Impossible sequel is kind of a synthesis of like that woke box ticking, but also kind of like the more traditional stuff that would appeal to like the MAGA crowd. And I'm wondering how you see that going, since I was again mutual friend of ours that went on Ancient Problems podcast, and I don't know, I'm less convinced of it now, but for a while I thought we might see a wave of what I called like MAGA exploitation or hillbilly elegy core, or we see kind of they're like Hollywood is like, okay, we've tried too hard, we pushed too far in this direction, let's just go back to something tried and true to try to make some money and just do something that's a little bit more pandery to cultural conservatives and just do Mission Impossible 6, bring back Arnie, endless Chris Pratt, stuff like that. How do you see that going? And I guess as a follow-up, like, do you think the supposed vibe shift has been overstated, or is it just getting started?
I'll start with the end there. When it comes to the vibe shift, I don't think it's really overstated. I think it is manifesting itself. across both Hollywood and the media industry and journalistic writing. I think there definitely was a message that was received by maybe more ideological left types that they had kind of overreached a bit. Now, whether or not there might be a thermostatic backlash once Trump's out, that's kind of the main question mark for me. I think in the time of Trump, you will see this vibe shift continue to manifest itself. That is my belief. My question would be, what happens after him? Does it continue, or is there a thermostatic backlash and we actually get like woke, the revenge of woke or something? That's the question that remains to be seen for me. I will say when it comes to Mission Impossible and Top Gun, I'd actually make a delineation between the two. I don't think they're actually the same thing. Top Gun, I think, is speaking to more what you were talking about in terms of pandering to the MAGA crowd a bit. I actually enjoyed the film. I enjoyed the original Top Gun, and I thought the new one was pretty good. It was a fun movie, but it was definitely pandering to a more social conservative crowd, to the MAGA crowd. Mission Impossible, I think, is a little bit different. Mission Impossible is a film that I would almost call, it is not anti-woke at all. It is post-woke, is how I would sort of situate Mission Impossible. It sort of imbibes a lot of the woke principles, but more so implicitly and not explicitly. But it also kind of would appeal. It's still an action film that, a MAGA guy could really get behind. So I kind of see it as Hollywood strains reconciliation, trying to kind of forge a new path for the general kind of summer blockbuster film. And I think that might be the formula that they go for in the future. And just a real quick, what I mean by post woke is that some film, you mentioned earlier that there is also this sort of conservative corollary of the pandering with, I think, the Daily Wire's really terrible cartoon shows. I don't know if you've seen those. I mean,
or Yellowstone type shit.
Yeah, so I don't know too much about Yellowstone, but yeah, especially the Daily Wire stuff. It's just dreadful. It's just horrible. It's not interesting. It's not funny. It's just, let's own the libs TV show.
What was that show, Mr. Burcham? Or
Yeah,
there's a couple like that. It's like,
they made one or two
painfully unfunny, painfully cringe type shit. Or was it the chick that got kicked off of Star Wars? Gina Carl, something Italian. The really, really bad movie. So that's what I see over and over again. The super, super reactionary stuff is like head and shoulders worse than the woke stuff, because at least the woke stuff is usually made competently at the very least, but like the reactionary stuff is just like unredeemable dog shit to me.
Yeah, it's almost like a poor facsimile.
Yeah.
I don't have too much experience with, like, I've never seen Yellowstone, and I've only seen this a couple of clips of those Daily Wire shows. But yeah, I'd actually agree with you. They are worse. They are more on the nose. I will say there are some woke-ish films in the past decade that I still found some value in. I thought they were interesting. And you kind of had to roll your eyes a little bit at the over the top sections that maybe were hitting on something. I mean, I don't know, maybe a movie like Lady Bird or whatever. That kind of comes to mind to me of something that definitely had a woke agenda, but was still an enjoyable film that kind of hit on a cultural moment in the 90s. But yeah, I think Hollywood's going to have to, they might, when it comes to the pandering to the conservative thing, I think that's still going to be a fairly low budget, it's just going to be a low budget thing that some production companies kind of go for. What was that film that was released, I think 2 or 3 years ago, about the drug traffic or the sex trafficking?
Oh yeah. I don't remember
Yeah.
what it was called, but I remembered it being like very profitable, but not a huge audience, because it was made for relatively cheap, because it was more or less outside of the Hollywood system. Sound of Freedom. That was it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So you'll see stuff like that. You'll see probably the Daily Wire continue to try and make their trite. But I think Hollywood in general is probably going to kind of go for the Mission Impossible route for these bigger budget blockbuster films. I think the vibe shift is real. I think it has manifested. But that being said, I would tell people that are maybe conservatives and want to be triumphant about it is, again, Mission Impossible is not anti-woke. It is post-woke. All of the woke principles are in this film. It's just they are almost just accepted. There's no need to propagandize for them. They've just they've won. It's almost
Mhm.
triumphant, to be honest with you. They won the battle, and they have, you know, the tomboy girl who kicks ass, and they have the black best friend, and they have I don't know, the gay characters that are just sort of seamlessly weaved into the story. So, you know, if you're someone who's really against all those things, yeah, you're still not going to enjoy Hollywood going forward. But I would say, generally speaking, for most people, Mission Impossible will work. You know, the kind
Yeah.
of person that would kind of roll their eyes like, oh, really, with this woke stuff, can I just watch a movie? I think they're going to be placated going forward. Now, again, after Trump, who knows?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say that because I would say, again, I feel like the people who are like just totally triggered by the very existence of a gay person or something like that, it's kind of like I think it's a very, very small minority in the same way that like the
Yeah.
super, super woke people who get, you know, totally triggered by any sort of like, oh, this is heteronormativity, blah, blah, blah. Like these are very small fringes. And it kind of makes me think of, and again, like, forgive me, you're probably more well versed in the film world, but from my casual understanding that like, the 70s New Hollywood had that decade of, and the end of the 60s as well, that very countercultural, like they didn't call it woke at the time, but the hippie, feminism, et cetera, et cetera. And I got to be a little bit too much, and there was that cultural backlash in the 80s. But like
Mhm.
and I'm sure we'll get to talking about it in a second. But like Arnold and all these action movies of the 80s, in some ways were very reactionary, but they didn't really walk back a lot of the fundamental presuppositions of the 60s and 70s. They just incorporated them in and kind of masked them up a little bit. And kind of in the same way that I think of the 90s like that, we had that same level of, liberal and revolutionary swing to it. Whereas the 2000s were able to kind of reintegrate it. I've heard it called the, like the vulgarity wave in the late 90s and 2000s. And they're able to synthesize these two worldviews in a way. And I'm wondering if we're going to see that swing again, because I think you're probably roughly the same age as me, but like the 2000s, like, I mean, I know some people on the right who act like it's been like, ever since the 1960s, just been this long march of only progressive things in Hollywood and the media, but that's really not true. Like, there's a lot of, you could even call it like conservative cancel culture in the 2000s of like, the Dixie Chicks getting basically canceled for
Mm.
opposing the Iraq War. It was very funny, like Michael Moore criticizing George Bush at the Oscars and everybody booed him. And funny enough, like, you see the video and it's a lot of these same actors and actresses who went on to become super woke. So I don't know. I'm interested to see if how they're going to synthesize all this, because to me it feels like right now this level of culture war is just totally not sustainable. And even like and I don't mean this in like the dastardly control type of way, but even like if you're a shareholder on the bottom line, okay, we have to bring everybody back in, because to me the best example is Star Wars. Because I'm somebody who um a lot of like up until the last couple of years, the quote unquote woke stuff didn't really bother me as long as the movie was good. But the Star Wars sequels, the Disney era, has been mostly dog shit. And some of the stuff that they did, like, and I'm somebody who doesn't have a problem with diversity and representation in movies. I love filmmakers like John Waters, stuff like that. I just like, if it has a good story, I'm okay with it. But I remember thinking specifically with the Disney Star Wars, the originals were made in the 70s and very early 80s. So it was almost entirely white people. Fair enough. It was a different time. And in the new ones, they made a very concerted effort to make sure that the rebels were very diverse, had women, various non-white ethnicities. But then they went out of their way to like all of the empires, all just white men. And
Yep.
I'm not even like giga triggered by that. It's just like, it's the kind of thing that just rubs me the wrong way. So I don't know, kind of rambling question, but about how there's going to be, maybe some kind of integration there. And what do you think? Like, because I wonder what the arc of this is going to be, because it felt like the stuff was reactionary. Like the height of woke was when Trump was in office, not when he was out. So I'm curious to how that's going to go.
Yeah, like you said, there's a lot there. When it comes to, yeah, I remember I watched the Rogue One film. Yeah, that
Hmm.
one.
Hmm.
I'm not a big Star Wars person. I was when I was a kid. I liked the prequels and I liked
Hmm.
the original. And I have seen the three new ones, which were yeah, pretty not good. I'll put it that way.
Hmm.
But Rogue One, I remember just being struck with like, wow, yeah, every single good guy is some kind of diverse representation person, and then every bad guy is just like, the snarling white guy.
Hmm.
And it was just too much. That's just the propagandistic end of woke being pushed too far to a point where I think it does just kind of, like you said, rub people the wrong way. The amount of people that the minority of people you mentioned that would be outraged is small, but a lot of people just, you inherently feel something's kind of, you feel almost attacked,
Hmm.
like you're being accused when you're watching a film like that. Honestly, I would say going forward, again, what happens after Trump, we'll see. But I think it almost might be the kind of thing that we ridiculed back in the day, of the kind of boomer conservative, like, I don't care that he's a black guy, he's a nice guy or something like that. I think you're just gonna kind of
Hmm.
have this. It's gonna be the Mission Impossible thing. It's just, we're gonna take woke in, and it's gonna be accepted, and it's just gonna be a part of the standard way we go about um, thinking about what America is. And I think that's what you have to do, frankly speaking. Now,
Hmm.
maybe I don't want that to be, maybe other people don't want it to be, but if you want there to be a somewhat cohesive, functional country, I think you have to just do that. Whether we like it or not, what was in the past is no longer, and it probably won't come back. So there has to be some sort of reconciliation. So I guess the question is kind of, will the Trump forces let that play out, or are they going to sort of push for their own sort of reactionary movement to take precedent? And will the sort of, let's say, radical wokesters, are they going to just kind of accept their victory and, you know, sort of enmesh themselves into the general American society without always sort of pitching a fit about white males? So yeah, it remains to be seen, but I think it has to be the Mission Impossible if things are going to
Hmm.
work in any kind of coherent and workable way.
I think you're right. It does remain to be seen because it feels like, at least to me, as somebody who, I guess you could call me more of an independent, and I'm, uh, and honestly, like kind of an admitted rootless cosmopolitan type. Like, I live in a larger city. At some point, I'd like to move somewhere smaller when I can afford a home there. But none of that stuff is things that bothers me. But the very conspicuous side of it, like I mentioned with Star Wars, it does rub me the wrong way. That having been said, I think we'll see. Maybe the vibe ship could be um, overstated, or at the very least, they might also overplay their hand in the same way. Where I saw like Trump wanted to have like his envoy to Hollywood or whatever, and of all the people he picked, Mel Gibson was the only one who was even remotely noteworthy. Everybody else is just kind of wash ups. So I guess we'll kind of see how that happened, because it could definitely um, overplay their hand. But since already so far, and again, as an independent, I went into, and we're recording this June 22nd. I went into the second Trump administration, like at least, like, we'll at least keep an open mind. I've not been particularly impressed so far. And for context, because this is released a little bit after we record it, yesterday was the strike of Iran, and I'm also interested to see, because it feels like how Hollywood is going to, and I guess the entertainment and media industry more broadly, how if there is a broader conflict with Iran or Russia, escalates, whatever. I'm really interested to see if they get in line in the same way that they did with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. To me, that kind of feels like it might be the main sticking point, because that's the consent that they really need to manufacture, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and I think if I was going to be bold enough to make a prediction on that, I would say they probably will. I mean, Trump in his first administration and his first campaign his whole thing was being the anti-Middle East interventionist. And I think the left kind of almost positioned themselves as the opposition in that way, and were much more willing to do so. So I don't think there's this sort of I don't think they have much of a leg to stand on if they really want to oppose him on this. Now there's that kind of radical wing of sort of pro-Palestinian that does have a leg to stand on, but they're not really the majority of the party. So I think they'd have a hard time making a real case as to why this is some big affront to anything that they stand for. So yeah, if the vibe shift continues, if Hollywood wants to continue in the Mission Impossible framework, I think that they kind of will fall in line with it, regardless of what my opinion of whether or not it's the right course or whatever. I think that they will.
Yeah, I suppose we'll see. It's one of those things, or at least for me right now, it feels like everything is just so incredibly up in the air that it feels like it's very difficult to make predictions, even about broader trends. It seems like everything will just change so quickly.
Yeah, we live in an age of epistemic uncertainty, and it leaves us all kind of becalmed in an ocean, trying to figure out which way to go and where we're all debating on if the wind's going to come in from this direction or that. And yeah, it's hard. It's hard to figure out. It's also it's not just the uncertainty. I would almost say it's the overwhelming amount of information that causes sort of the tyranny of choice, right? You have all these different choices of ideas or ways things can go, that you kind of become immobilized. And yeah.
No, and that makes sense. And that kind of leads me to one of the other things that I wanted to talk to you about. In two pieces that you wrote that I thought were interesting contrasts with each other, is you wrote reviews of the film La Samurai and The Last Action Hero. And I thought they were, and I don't know if you did this intentionally, but they're interesting counterpoints to each other in the sense that they're both kind of takes on that hero mythology that especially see in Hollywood. Both, the Samurai being kind of that noir kind of detective thing, and it is kind of the last ride of this this kind of hard-boiled detective, slash hitman. Whereas The Last Action Hero was you could probably describe it better than I could, not quite parody, but kind of send up of these tropes of, and again, it's Arnold Schwarzenegger very appropriately, but that era of the big muscly kind of, action hero guy from the more, I guess you could say, reactionary 80s action hero film genre. And they're both kind of dealing with the end of that hero myth and kind of deal with it in different ways. And I was wondering if that was intentional, and if you want to expand on either of those, because I think those are both interesting case studies to have in contrast with each other.
Yeah, I'll say it was not intentional. But to your point, they kind of both speak to different times of what masculinity was. But I also think they're both universal in terms of how they speak to masculinity. And I don't know if I necessarily think they are as opposite, or as in as much opposition as maybe you're kind of viewing them. But I guess, yeah, The Last Action Hero I kind of view as almost the apotheosis of the action film. It's sort of the last action film. It's fitting. It's larger than life. It takes all the action tropes and it ramps them up, and it's fully aware of it the whole time, tongue in cheek, but it also kind of celebrates it. It's not a parody. It's not trying to eviscerate it or make fun of it. It's celebration. It's sort of that celebration with a tongue in cheek of masculinity. But it still hits on, I think, the larger points of what we might find to be an aspirational man and things that you would still find in samurai, which is basically self-composure, dealing with situations as they come, rolling with the punches, these sort of larger themes.
No, I guess I didn't even mean opposition, but just kind of a contrast. But I see what you mean, and I think that was both, as you said, interesting ways of looking at masculinity. And I'm curious, do you think that there are any modern films that kind of deal with the same question? Because it's no secret that it seems to be we're in a number of moments of cultural crisis, as you mentioned. But one of the ones that seems to be really coming to a head is the crisis of what masculinity means in the modern world. And I have my submission. I don't know if you saw the most recent Ridley Scott Napoleon movie, but it kind of makes me think of that. But I'm curious to your thoughts.
Yeah, I actually haven't seen the Napoleon film yet. I'd like to. I find Napoleon a very interesting figure in history, and so I think I'm a little hesitant because I don't want to be disappointed. There was a interesting 2000s, I think, miniseries about him that's pretty good. I don't know if you've ever heard of that or seen it, but yeah, when it comes to sort of the meditation on masculinity, there is kind of a through line through the samurai. It sort of kicked off the standard of the sort of loner guy in the big city, seedy big city subgenre, which would later manifest itself in things like Taxi Driver or Drive in 2011, and most recently Joker in 2019. So, less so with Joker. I don't, Joker's not necessarily anything to celebrate. I would say the one film that did strike me as there's actually a couple. So one that comes to mind is a film called Minari. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
Mm-mm.
So Minari is a Korean American film. I believe the director was born in Korea and later emigrated to the United States, and it's kind of a biopic as I understand it. And it's I believe it's a Korean family growing up in it's something like Arkansas, maybe Alabama, somewhere in the deep South in the 80s. And I found the one of the main characters is the father, played by Stephen Yeun, and I found that was a great meditation on sort of the masculine archetype that I think needs celebration. He was a man who was coming to a new country. He had a lot of burden on his shoulders of trying to care for his family and assimilate into this new culture, make money, make his own farm, and things go wrong, and he has trouble with his wife, he has trouble with his kids, he has trouble with the farm and making the necessary money he needs, and yet he always kind of keeps going forward. He carries the burden on his shoulder, not necessarily in I'm someone that's a bit skeptical of stoicism taken a bit too far, right? He's not someone who just hides it all, but he bears it and he does what he can for those that matter to him. So I think that was one of the better ones. And again, it kind of goes into what I was saying though earlier, of to kind of find these things, you almost have to go into other cultures' mediums, because in the United States there was this kind of woke moment where anything that even slightly smelled of toxic masculinity was eschewed from any film.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because I mentioned the Napoleon movie, and I would say have the right expectations going into it. I thought it was a very interesting movie, almost as a commentary on like the Napoleon myth, and this is something I'm working on writing out on, and it might be out by the time this is released. But to me, it feels like the Ridley Scott Napoleon film is both a commentary on the mythology of Napoleon, as well as, at least to me, it felt like, and you can make the masculinity argument angle as well, but it's assuming that, like, there's nobody who is going into this movie who is like, well, gee golly, wow, I've never heard of this Napoleon guy before, let's see what's going on. It's understanding that Napoleon failed, and it's contrasting the greatness of what he was able to accomplish with his personal failures as well as his ultimate failure, which I know some people didn't like. And I can understand them. There's parts of it that rub me the wrong way, but I do feel like, again, there is something to that masculine urge of, that you are going to lose, but you're dealt a losing hand, but you still play it. And much in the same way, I'm interested to your thoughts about that, or in general of, you mentioned the last action hero being, more or less the last action film that was made unironically. And it feels like we have a lot of that with, John Wick, or a lot of these other films that are made with a nod and a wink or an intentional subversion, where it feels like, as a culture, we're and I think in a lot of ways, good reasons, hesitant to play these things straight, if for no other reason that they can be a little bit corny, but finding a way to power through that and reclaim these things in a different context is something that, to me, that I think is very important.
Yeah, it's sort of, we're almost in a crisis of sincerity to a certain
Mm-hmm.
extent. And I think part of that just comes from sincerity is scary. It's open. When you're sincere, you're open about your intentions, you're open about your feelings and your thoughts, which means maybe you're wrong, maybe people disagree with them. Whereas with irony, there's always that sort of safe, plausible deniability, right? Oh, I was just
Mm-hmm.
being ironic. I didn't really mean that. You can always kind of recuse yourself of what you had said previously.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, sincerity requires kind of putting your foot down and saying, I believe this. Um, which is kind of interesting to say in light of the woke moment. Someone might even argue that the woke moment was sincere to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe these filmmakers were simply putting their foot down and saying, I believe this.
I would say cynical
Um,
but sincere is kind of the impression I get with a lot of it. Not all of it, but a good chunk.
yeah, yeah. I would agree with that. I think I would be hesitant to say that it was just this, we're just going to go with whatever the current thing is.
Mm-hmm.
Again, with Disney, with the go woke, go broke, I think it's kind of evident that you have to have some sort of belief to continue down the route that some of these production companies have gone down. And I agree with, there can be this sort of overwrought sentimentality that can be in films, and certain decades are kind of full of that. Maybe the 50s is pretty,
90s particular to me.
okay. So can you give me an
Well,
example?
the 90s was very hit and miss with it. Like, to me, like um Forrest Gump or The Legend of Bagger Vance, what is it? Shawshank Redemption. So you have both like very overwrought sincerity, but also like a lot of detached irony. So it's very hit and miss in that era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can kind of see that. It is kind of a
Mhm.
weird transitionary period going from the 80s to the 2000s.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that's also why, again, a lot of these Asian films that I've mentioned, I would say they are very sincere. Drive My Car is very sincere. It's a very sincere meditation on what it's on, things that are difficult, I think, in a masculine sphere to also acknowledge truthfully and honestly. Things like infidelity, a man losing, a man's wife being, cheating on him, going outside their marriage, and how he deals with that. I think in right wing spheres, there's this kind of just knee jerk reaction of like, oh well, he needs just to leave her. She doesn't like him anymore, and it's just kind of this,
Mhm.
he's not the alpha in her eyes, and she,
Or the other side of it being, the left, you're like, oh, well, monogamy is fake and
right.
oppressive, and actually, that, what's his face, the Dan Savage thing was like, oh, if you're in a marriage for 30 years and your partner only cheats on you once or twice, that's statistically speaking a good marriage.
Yeah, and the film grapples with this really honestly. But I guess there's kind of two sides to sentimentality. There you can be, or sincerity. You can be sincere in a way that is kind of just
Schmaltzy.
namby-pamby, schmaltzy. Yeah, you're moralistic almost. You're just kind of trying to push this frame. Whereas sincerity done right is, I think, the ultimate form of art, and that it's messy. If we
Mhm.
are sincere, humans. I'm someone who also, I think you're similar to me. Like, I'm not a particularly religious person. I came actually from like new atheism back in the day.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I don't have this sort of objective worldview. I have a very, frankly, subjective worldview. I don't think you can have an objective worldview without some sort of centralized authority that grants it to you. But that point aside, sentimentality is honesty. It's dealing with the fact that we don't make sense. We contradict ourselves all the time. Nothing is as clear and cut as we'd like it to be.
Mhm.
And we need to kind of understand that and do our best within that framework. And Drive My Car, I think, is a perfect example of something like that. There's another Japanese film, Perfect Days. I thought the Korean film Parasite, they're grappling with the real problems of just being a human. And that's why they
Mhm.
speak to someone who, I don't know Korean. I've been to Japan one time, right? I don't know these cultures that intricately, but they can speak to me really profoundly and be some of my favorite films in spite of that.
Well, because to me, that's the other side of. Well, it made me think of two things. The first one being um, the other side of when people complain about wokeness, and especially people on the right who and like I do have sympathies with um, some of the more right wing cultural conservative stuff, even though I came from the left. Obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be talking to people like you or Rajiv. But to me, like that is the beauty of filmmaking and art in general, that like it allows you to empathize with people who are outside of your in group and understand the human, like the universality of humanity, and find a way like, okay, yes, we are different, but we do have these commonalities, and we're able to find some way to communicate to each other, which is why, at least to me, the woke shit feels so phony, because they have like the causality reversed, is they start with like a very superficial difference that is very front loaded, and they try to superimpose that universality onto it, or either that, or have like inverted patriarchy, inverted racism, and I feel like it rubs a lot of people the wrong way because of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to put it. Is it's inversion. It's not sincerity,
Mhm.
because frankly speaking, sincerity will grapple with the fact that um, people of different ethnicities will have differences and they'll have conflicts. It's not
Mhm.
we won't have that sort of race blind utopia. There's going to be conflict. There's going to be different interpretations, and it's going to get messy. And to do
Mhm.
that is difficult because it might piss someone off. You might who knows? Maybe your internal locus might bend the film a certain way that people find off-putting to them, or they think that
Mhm.
it doesn't shine the best light on their particular idea or group or whatever what have you. And that's what I
Mhm.
think sincerity is. It's difficult because you might piss people off, and you don't have that plausible deniability. You don't have the irony as a defense mechanism, because
Mhm.
irony ultimately is armor. And to be sincere is to kind of just put your heart on your sleeve and say, this is what I think, this is what I feel. And it's not it's not as much of a declaration. And I think that's where wokeism kind of gone wrong. Maybe there was a hint of sincerity in terms of I believe these things, but when you make this sort of declaration, you're not being quite honest, because no one's 100% sure of anything at any time. We're always trying to figure things out. We're always changing our minds. We're always kind of moving forward. And sincerity, I think, captures that.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially because I feel like when you have to take that, and again, so much of the, I guess you could say, more, quote unquote, diverse viewpoints, they were in some ways alienating, but they were more interesting and honest. And I feel like some of these older things play better because of that viewpoint. Like for me, for example, a filmmaker like John Waters is somebody who, like, everybody likes to, like, oh no, you couldn't make Blazing Saddles today. You couldn't make most of what John Waters does because it would be considered problematic even to the people who would be considered the core audience. But that is genuinely what he thinks is interesting and cool, or interesting filmmaking. And it kind of makes me think of, have you either seen there's a TV show called The Orville by Seth MacFarlane, or the movie Cloud Atlas?
I'm aware of the Orville, almost kind of like a Star Trek parody.
Yeah. Mhm.
And
Pretty
then
much.
Cloud Atlas, I have heard it, and I cannot tell you exactly what it
Yeah.
is.
It's a Wachowski's flick, but in either
Ah,
case, like so the two examples I'm giving there is because the Orville, like it's something that I've written before. It's a piece called Spite, Sincerity in Seth MacFarlane, and it's basically a Star Trek parody that more or less became like Seth MacFarlane's backdoor into like making his own Star Trek fanfic. And it's hit or miss. And if you don't like Star Trek, you're probably not going to like it. But Seth MacFarlane basically drops the parody angle and he just, basically makes his Star Trek show. And even if you don't like it, and like it has a lot of shit lib politics, but it is like intensely sincere. Like you can tell, Seth MacFarlane is obviously like, your typical Hollywood lib, maybe a bit of a shitlord, but otherwise your bog standard Hollywood lib. But this is genuinely what Seth MacFarlane believes. This is genuinely what he thinks, and it's genuinely, what he thinks is important to talk about. And because of that, for me, it ended up resonating with me deeply, even though there's some, pretty shitty and heavy-handed episodes. But this is what he genuinely believes. In much in the same way, Cloud Atlas it was made about over a decade ago. And it's the Wachowskis, and they're very hit or miss. But it is like in the same way, it is a very um, intensely sincere thing, and it has some things like, and again, like say what you will about the Wachowskis now being, woke or whatever, but they do things like makeup to change people's races because it's about like reincarnation and the how the choices you make will affect different people in the future. And it's very corny and ham-fisted at times, but also it's one of my favorite movies. That was actually I almost picked that for our episode of Inquina Veritas for
mhm.
that reason because it's an intensely sincere movie, and to me, I feel like that's something that is going to age better than a lot of the snarky irony that we see today.
Yeah, I suppose I would almost find myself a Seth MacFarlane apologist too, and that a lot of what you said is kind of relevant to even Family Guy. As a kid
Mm-hmm.
who grew up watching it, even despite not being allowed to, and loved it for that reason. Um, as dumb as that show can kind of be, as gross and stupid, especially through the vector of Brian, you do get
Mm-hmm.
Seth's kind of unalloyed feelings, his thoughts. Um,
Mm-hmm.
he was very sincere in that show, and in a strange way. Obviously, it's a pretty stupid
Yeah.
show, but it really wasn't ironic. That's what I would say about it. It was not ironic. It was, um, he was actually saying what he felt about various topics, obviously in a funny lens, but um,
Mm-hmm.
nonetheless very sincere.
Well, they had that one episode. I don't know if you saw where Brian and Stewie get trapped in a like a bank vault. Did you happen to see that one?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the one where it's just basically no jokes. Well, there are some jokes like no cutaways. Um, Brian slash presumably his vector with Brian, talking about suicidal ideation and stuff like that. And at the time, I remember thinking that it was kind of heavy-handed and corny, but kind of and this is another thing where like it came out like a decade ago. So maybe I just like, wasn't primed for it, or is at a different time in my life. But I look on something like that a lot more fondly now than I did at the time. That somebody just putting themselves out there like that is it's something that I find a lot more admirable, even if I don't agree with it or like it. Especially when you get to that level of success where there's legitimately a risk there.
Yes. Yeah. Again, that's it's something that I think is very much lost nowadays. I think particularly the Zoomer generation has kind of a struggle with sincerity. They almost in particular are, I would say, very ironic all the time. Even
Mm-hmm.
a lot of their jokes, a lot of their slang, it's
Mm-hmm.
kind of ironic in and of itself. And don't get me wrong, I mean, irony has its place, and you could almost maybe look at at the '80s as maybe sincerity taken a bit too far. Um, but yeah, I think we could use a nice injection of sincerity in our media. I think that would be for the better, for sure.
Yeah, I would agree. Kind of the same way where like much in the way that you're a Seth MacFarlane apologist, I'm a prequels apologist when it comes to Star Wars, that like, say what you will about Jar Jar Binks, but that shit was not focus tested, That's something that George Lucas thought was gonna slay and he thought it was great. And, George Lucas was, that was more or less one man's vision for better and for worse, which I feel like, and again, this is maybe my millennial bias, but I feel that the Star Wars prequels are going to age better than the sequels for that reason alone. That I
Oh
mean, if
yeah.
for no reason that like sincerity aside, that there's like actual a storytelling cohesion there, whereas the Star Wars sequels are just so all over the place.
I totally agree. I also like the prequels. Episode one, right? Yeah,
Mhm.
nowadays episode one. Um, I loved that film. Now, a
Same.
part of that, I have to be honest, is that I was like 5 or 6 when I first saw it, or something like that,
Mhm.
and I just grew up with it, and I thought Obi-Wan was really cool, and Qui-Gon Jinn, and all the rest of it, and I thought Jar Jar was hilarious. So,
Same. Yeah.
as,
Jar Jar,
as
I
a,
saw it at just the right age where Jar Jar Binks was
yeah,
the funniest thing I'd ever seen in my life. The pod
yes,
racing was cool. Um, and honestly, like I'll say as well, like the world building and set design and costume design, I think like have a lot of heart and soul that you just don't really see quite as much anymore in modern filmmaking, especially like on that level. Because I think like the 90s were kind of a second golden age as far as sci-fi goes, because they had people from like the George Lucas generation who grew up watching like the Flash Gordon stuff, where they had a little bit more wonderment that came with sci-fi, and then they're able to come through, the boomer generation, and come through near that end and do some very interesting things with sci-fi, like that or artificial intelligence, some of those other movies that um, I think history is going to be kinder to them.
yeah, yeah, and to go back to Star Wars, I very much agree that the prequels will be remembered far more fondly. I think that's already happened. I don't think people
Mhm.
have as much atavistic hatred for them as they used to.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, of the prequels, I think only episode two it deserves like any real derision.
Yeah,
Um,
it has its
it-
moments, but it's probably the biggest stinker. Although I will
yeah,
say, and I don't want to make this too much of a prequels apologist podcast, I do think for all Hayden Christensen's fault, that one scene where he gets clowned on, other than the sand one, where he talks about killing all the sand people. I think that's actually like legitimately good acting from him, and there are like moments in that movie that are good, but overall, yeah, that one's kind of a stinker.
yes, yeah. I actually haven't seen those particular three prequels in probably over a decade, but
Mhm.
I will say episode three is actually, I think, a pretty good film and a pretty good
Yeah,
Star Wars entry. I like that film. I would go back. I would watch it again without much of an issue.
I would
And
agree.
the three sequels were, yeah, well, we already kind of know. With episode the last one
Mhm.
being particularly just unforgivably bad, in my opinion. But
Funny enough, that was probably the one that I enjoyed the most, just because, like, well, the
really,
first one, like, it was just a not shot for shot, a beat for beat remake of A New Hope. The second one, the less said about it, the better. Maybe some interesting ideas that I don't want to relitigate The Last Jedi, but maybe they didn't have enough time or whatever. But it felt like an anti Empire Strikes Back, whereas I don't even remember what the last one is called, but my best friend and my wife were like, because I just got mad at the first. I was like, I'm not going to watch them. And then my best friend and my wife were like, all right, we have to watch this. This is such a clusterfuck. So they like got me drunk first. And like whenever there was a particularly bad scene, they're like, all right, take a shot because this is going to be stupid. But I remember like it was terrible, but I kind of enjoyed it because it felt like the movie that I would have made when I was like 11 years old if you put me in charge of making a Star Wars movie, if that makes sense.
it does make sense with Palpatine's
Yeah.
return. Yeah,
Uh,
that was the thing that I had. It was just like,
somehow.
this is actually how we're doing this. Okay. But yeah, it's funny too. Is the third one I also had no intention of seeing. I showed up to the theater with my friend and girlfriend at the time, and we totally missed the schedule somehow. I don't even know what we were going to see, and that was there, and we're like, all right, guess we'll see it. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably a good place to start ending it. But Theon, do you have any plugs and promotions, anything upcoming that you'd like to promote, more broadly speaking?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd keep it pretty simple. Check out my Substack Ultimatum. I write about film and literature. Like I said, trying to do a bit of a deeper analysis. I've recently started a podcast called In Kino Veritas, in which I bring on a guest, and they pick a film. I watch it, and then we discuss the film. And you're going to be on this pretty soon here too, so that'll be exciting. So yeah, sort of getting my legs when it comes to podcasting. So forgive me if I'm trying to find myself sometimes, but I think we're getting along. And then I would also just say, yeah, I'm a co-owner of something called the Tortuga Society, a group in which we just try and sort of teach guys how to. It's a fraternal order where we try and basically juice asymmetric strategies to do better in this difficult job economy, especially for white collar workers. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely check that out as well.
Well, Theon, thank you so much. And I got to say, so far so good. You're doing pretty well, man. It takes a little while to get your feet under you as a podcaster, at least in my experience. And I think you've definitely hit the ground running.
Well, I really appreciate that. And once again, thanks for having me on.
No problem. So I just have one last question. So this is the ending question I do for all my guests. So what is something, we didn't get into the doom and gloom today, but the world is a little bit crazy and fucked up right now. What's something that makes you feel hopeful for the future, or, what's something that would?
Okay. I would say I'm almost going to do an inversion of this question because I don't have a good answer prepackaged. And I would say, personally, for me, I find the narrative of doom and gloom surrounding artificial intelligence to be overblown, and it's not something that I'm particularly worried about. And I can expand on that if you'd like, or we can leave it there. But I would say, I don't think that that's going to necessarily be an existential threat to our existence. And that might be my Paul Krugman moment. So we'll see. But,
I guess we'll say, you know what, let's leave it there for now, and maybe we'll talk about it at another podcast, because I'm also a little bit of a nothing ever happens guy when it comes to AI. But in any case, Theon, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been fun, and yeah, looking forward to doing Kino Veritas.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
All right, thanks a lot, man. Have a good one.